Humanitarian work suffers as the United Nations faces a severe funding crisis. The UN says they need $20 billion, but have only received 5, meaning 38 countries in dire need of assistance will see their funding cut. What will happen to the millions who rely on aid to survive? And is the UN spending money wisely? I'm Andrea Sankey, and today's Newsmaker is the UN funding gap. Though some may not feel it, the planet is currently facing the biggest food and nutrition crisis in our history. And 2024 could get even worse. After COVID-19 ravaged the global economy and the war in Ukraine threatened food supplies, some 345 million people are now food insecure. That's according to the World Food Program. And now the UN says it's being forced to cut humanitarian assistance due to a desperate funding shortfall. Though conflict and poverty remain a primary cause of acute hunger around the world, climate change and the multiple natural disasters that it goes with means worse is likely ahead. Here's a look now at who is feeling the consequences.
Aid organizations used to give us assistance, but now that aid has stopped. Everything has stopped.
Yemen remains one of the world's worst humanitarian crises, with 4.5 million people internally displaced. Over 2/3 of the population are living below the poverty line. The UNHCR is the only international agency addressing their humanitarian needs. In 2023, the UN estimates that 21.6 million people in Yemen will require humanitarian assistance. But this month, it'll be forced to cut aid to 7 million of them due to insufficient funding.
With the lack of support provided to Yemen, the crisis will grow bigger and people's needs will multiply. There is no doubt that the ultimate solution for Yemen is for the war to stop, which would pave the way for displaced people to go back to their provinces.
In March, the World Food Program cut rations by up to 75% for communities in Afghanistan facing emergency levels of hunger. 2 months later, it was forced to cut food for 8 million people. That's 2/3 of the people it had assisted. In Syria, 5.5 million people who relied on the World Food Program were already on 50% rations. And just last month, the agency cut all rations to nearly half of them. And in the Palestinian territories, the World Food Program cut its cash assistance by 20% in May and in June. Those are just some examples of countries facing funding cuts. More than 30 others are in similar positions.
When the most vulnerable at critical levels of food insecurity, when they don't receive our food assistance, there are only two ways. Either they die or they move.
Now, the UN says it's looking to diversify its funding base to sustain its projects, but is calling on traditional donors to step up, as a lot more funding is still needed this year. China's envoy to the UN called for the international community to address the root causes of the problem by improving the global food and agricultural governance system, while America's top diplomat told the UN Council that hunger must not be weaponized, singling out Russia for pulling out of the Black Sea Grain Initiative.
100% of all Somalis use wheat. We pray to God for peace in Ukraine and everywhere. Let all wars stop, and we hope grain routes will remain open, God willing.
Meanwhile, the World Food Program says that in the short term, without any more funding, the agency simply can't help everyone.
So we're entering a humanitarian doom loop where we save people who are starving at the cost of allowing millions of others to fall closer into that same category. Ration cuts are clearly not the way to go forward. So my basic message here today is that world leaders must act to prioritize funding for humanitarian response, enhance coordination among aid organizations and governments, and invest in long-term solutions that can address the root causes of these crises.
So, can we avert the worst, or are millions more set to suffer from a lack of humanitarian funding? Well, joining me now to debate that are from Oslo, Jan Egeland. He is the Secretary General of the Norwegian Refugee Council. From Pretoria is Lise Korsten. She is the co-director of the DSI-NRF Center of Excellence in Food Security. And from Newark, Christopher Hegadorn. He is the Adjunct Professor of Global Food Politics at Sciences Po University and Consulting Fellow at Chatham House. Thanks all so much for being with me. It's been described, as we just heard and can see on our floor, as this humanitarian doom loop. And this is after the UN Secretary General said that the world is raging toward a food catastrophe back in 2022. Is that language, Christopher, I'll start with you, is it being used because millions are genuinely in danger of going hungry, or is it more out of anger over donors not coming to the plate?
Well, thank you, Andrea. No, the question or the comment is absolutely appropriate. The numbers have been going up for years. They're going up to levels that are simply unacceptable in the modern world in which we live. We have the food, we have the resources, we have the ability to get food where it needs to be. Now it's a question of political will, ending conflicts, delivering food, and making sure that the investments, long-term investments, are made to fix our food system.
But Christopher, the United Nations is not a poor organization. We know that many of their employees are extremely well paid. The benefits that come with the job are quite considerable. So shouldn't, cutting rations on humanitarian assistance, be only of the very last resort?
Well, those are two different questions entirely, whether we take a look at fixing the UN system, but the more important question at hand is do we have the resources to get money, to get food into the mouths and stomachs of those who are most desperate? The WFP reports that they need $25 billion this year. They've received pledges of $10 billion. That's a 60% plus 60% shortfall. That's the biggest ever in WFP's history. That's simply unacceptable. The money is there. We know that. The food is available. There needs to be political will, and it needs to be done quickly. WFP is already lowering out of 38 of its 86 country programs. It's already dropping resources. That means they're feeding those who are starving, but not those who are hungry. That's a choice that's simply unacceptable.
Okay. Jan Egeland, let me turn to you. We saw in our report, we saw a sample of just a few countries where the suffering will be manifest. But how much are we actually overlooking? How many crises are not getting attention right now?
Too many crises are truly neglected at this time and age. I cannot recall a time when we have been so focused on one crisis only, and that is Ukraine. Where it's also very, very terrible in that horrific war. But there is resources in Ukraine in all other emergencies where my organization in NRC is operating. We're catastrophically underfunded at the moment. In Afghanistan, the needs went up after the Taliban took over. And now the aid, the humanitarian funding has gone catastrophically down. There is 15 million Afghans are facing starvation. 13 million of those did get some food aid at the beginning of this year. Now it's 5 million. And if it continues with the funding shortfalls now, it means that all food aid will be more or less over at the end of October. And that is in a place where NATO countries spent trillions on their military campaign up until they left 2 years ago.
But as you know, there is this question of restructuring the spending with the money that so many organizations have, because at this point, so many countries are actually struggling with their national budgets right now. So is there not a way to better spend and distribute what is there rather than trying to get more funding?
No, I would take issue with that. I've been now in humanitarian work for 40 years. it's never been as efficient and effective as it is today. You mentioned there is a lot of well-paid UN types. Yes, I mean, there are some well-paid UN types in Geneva, New York, and a few even in Kabul and so on. But most of the food aid is distributed by local NGOs, civil society, and others. It's the amount of funding per tonnage per child that is definitely going down, and are so many countries struggling with their national issues. Well, I mean, most of the rich countries give 0.2% to foreign assistance. I think they keep not 99%; they keep 99.8% to themselves. So it's not like they cannot afford it.
Okay, let me turn to Lise in Pretoria. Give us your take from the food security, perspective, and you being an expert in that space. What maybe opportunities have been lost? We saw the loss of the Black Sea grain deal that has been very much talked about, and how that is affecting global food supplies. Have there been balls dropped at too many points in order to avoid what we're seeing now with the funding gap and the major food insecurity that we're all facing?
So what is very important is that we should keep in mind that it's a whole food systems collapse. It's not only the food at the end or at the point of consumption, but it's the combined effect of climate change, a disruption in your food production, a total destruction of valuable soils with climate change, flooding, and drought. So our ability to produce enough to pump into the food system and to have access to donate and move that food. So one thing is getting enough funding to pay for moving food from where it's produced to where it's most needed. And we also need to distinguish between critical points or flash points where we face starvation, severe hunger, and how can we move food quickly enough to them. And then, of course, the normal food chain that's been disrupted. So this is not a thing in isolation. It's holistic.
And you are particularly worried about how much worse it will get with climate change going forward. Talk a little bit more about that.
So what's very important with climate change is, and we've had COVID, and then we've had the Ukraine war and the disruption in trade flows. And what's very important to keep in mind that food was all over the world was held up. So we have food and enough food in our silos or in the field and the orchards, but for how long? And what we expect will happen is that come next year and the year thereafter, our pantries, our reserves will be emptied. And we are not able to keep putting food into the system. So food availability is one thing. Food affordability is another. Obviously, food nutrition and safety is another. But can we keep on pumping enough food into the system to feed all on planet Earth?
Christopher, how much are you worried about the scenario that Lise is describing there? And I mean, if that is what we're going to be facing, I mean, we're asking for funding now. If that is the end game, then it really, I fear to say, will kind of be every man out for himself, or every country out for itself in that case.
The risks are real, and Lise and Jan both are absolutely correct. Lisa's comments about the food system. This is a global challenge that the entire international community needs to really double down its efforts and its investments on. The Secretary General has created, back in 2021, the UN Food Systems Summit, and it's basically getting the entire UN system with countries, with donor organizations, banks, and others focused on fixing the long-term structural problems of the food system, which are being challenged in incredibly serious ways by the global climate change crisis. I'm working on a project now to launch an initiative on behalf of a number of CSOs to support countries doing that at COP28 That needs to be a major initiative and focal point with the climate community. But these challenges are only going to get worse. And if we don't invest in fixing the root causes, the costs you're talking about today are going to go up, and the numbers of hungry people are going to go up. It's a existential crisis that we need to invest long-term solutions for now.
I mean, an existential crisis. Jan Egeland, we're almost back to the same issue here. I was looking at, maybe spending restructuring, but if it comes down to having to beg for donations and funding at this point, and then circumstances will actually decline even further. And we have seen in the past years, we have to mention, the way countries have turned inward when it's come to certain crises, not least, migrants and refugees trying to get to safety and being rejected. So what is the scenario going forward? And it almost sounds as if it can't get better. I don't want to be that cynical, but can you give us a point of optimism here?
I'm an optimist still, really. Look at during the pandemic, we had all sorts of doomsday scenarios. The world actually came together and increased funding. There was much more support for refugees and displaced and so on for a period. World Food Programme had their programs much better funded. It's actually now that it's sort of turned around and we have become much more inward-looking, more nationalistic, and more drawn to one place, war in Europe. Doesn't have to be like that. And I agree with the others that, listen, the problem will not be for Norway or even for Turkey or UK or even South Africa. It will be for the countries where people spend nearly all of their disposable income on the daily bread today. I mean, if I'm a widow with 5 children, I have $2 a day, and I spend 90% on that on food. And food becomes twice as expensive. I will starve. My children will starve. As a Norwegian, I can afford the bread becoming twice as expensive because it would be 5, 6, 7% of my disposable income. So we have to focus on the bottom 2 billion of people, including the 110 million displaced now who are going increasingly hungry. What is happening at the moment is that we are cutting ration in country after country. I haven't seen a time where we have decreased rations as rapidly to as many people as we do today. Doesn't have to be like that. Part of the problem is that it's not the story that is reported. TRT is doing it, but the media is focusing on Ukraine and on American domestic politics. This is the biggest story of our time and age.
Right. I mean, as I cited before, cynically, it seems the world is becoming more and more every man for himself kind of attitude as per individual country now. We'll have to see if we can refocus the attention of especially wealthier countries on what really should be addressed in the immediate term. But let me turn to Lise, because we're looking at 2023 being the worst ever recorded for humanitarian need. Help us understand that, because we are not in a world war. We have so many more ways now to transport food. The agricultural revolution has still come by leaps and bounds, since, the past century over. How is it that without a world war, without these dire circumstances at present, and the pandemic now behind us, how are we actually facing what you've described?
So the food is currently congested in the system. We have certain pockets where we do produce enough food, where we have incredible yields, and we are able to move food. These are mostly the North, the US, where we do have mass production. But very importantly, we have the potential to produce more food in Africa, to make it more self-sustainable. So if you look at it from a food sovereignty point of view, and that's very important, can a country sustain enough and produce enough food for its own people, first and foremost, before they start trading? And the surplus, of course, trade. And yes, trade is a very important part of any economy of a country, and it helps it grow. But if you cannot be food secure at home, you as a nation it's immoral to then be food secure at a national level, but not look after your own people. And many countries are trapped in that, and particularly our own country, South Africa, where we need to really think of how we move food and how we make sure everyone gets their food. We also have mass displacement. So roughly 30 million people, and people will keep on migrating and moving, and people will move to where there's water and food. And these are the big concerns. And that's where we talk about a food systems tipping point. If the food system can keep on supplying enough for everyone in the whole system.
Okay. Where, though, help me better understand in detail where, for example, more agricultural output could be attained. You said in Africa there are multiple opportunities. Where, though? Because from what we're hearing, with climate change issues, that production is not secure.
Okay, what's very important is we will get a climate shift. So we will get certain areas where you will have less production, you will have more floods, more droughts, and then you'll have other areas that was previously not planted. And those we should now focus on and get them into production. We should also shift our food basket. We are focusing on a very small range of products, crops, to feed the world, and that's wrong. We have incredible diversity in Africa. We talk about our indigenous crops that we have not explored. It's got a high nutritional value. It is often resistant to drought and often more resistant to pests and diseases. But we don't have the technology to upscale, to produce more, and to distribute it better. And we need to create the markets for those indigenous crops. And that's the way we should start looking at food per se.
Okay, Christopher, seeing how desperate the situation actually is right now, why is this being overlooked, what Lise is describing? All these opportunities for better, more sustainable food production, why is it not being done?
I wouldn't say it's being overlooked. I think there is, in fact, quite a strong look at these issues, right? The issues around food up to the last couple of years have really been about producing the maximum number of calories. Now there's a fairly strong push within the UN system, within the scientific community, within many other communities, that food impacts the climate, food impacts the soil and our natural environment, our biodiversity. All of these things have to be looked at and addressed within the context of a system. Now that is incredibly hard. Where you push one button and something else changes, you need to be basically maneuvering all the dials at once and tracking, monitoring, looking at the data, making sure people have the proper seeds that can address the climate issues, drought, saline issues, etc. But that takes investment and it takes a long-term perspective. There needs to be more money put towards agriculture. It's starting, but it's not there yet. Countries like China, they need to not only invest in Chinese agriculture, but they need to start stepping up to address the humanitarian needs around the world. According to WFP, Mozambique in Africa gives more financial resources to WFP than China. How is that possible? The Gulf countries, the Emir of Qatar owns PSG soccer team. It's worth $5 billion. The money is there. It's a question of prioritization. It's a question of putting political leadership where it needs to be put.
Okay, let me ask Jan Egeland one final question. I mean, if you had the proverbial magic wand to make the decisions you believe would change this equation, what would you be doing? Would you talk to Qatar? Would you talk to China and have this done the way that we could avert this crisis?
Well, number one, I would end the war in Ukraine so that Ukraine and Russian food and fertilizer would get immediately to the international market. That would get prices down. And then I would definitely reorient priorities in very many countries, including, like Lise says, in Africa towards agriculture. I've been traveling in South Sudan. as long as the eye can see, there is arable land, in many areas, and at the moment there are mostly intercommunal clashes in those places. So it's if we could get conflict resolution going from Ukraine to South Sudan, and then invest in food, in sustainable food production, that is also climate resistance. Of course, we can feed a planet and the children of this planet.
Okay.
We have to just prioritize it.
Okay, Jan Egeland, that will have to be the final word for this edition of The Newsmakers. I'd like to thank all three of my panelists really so much for being with us, and our viewers, of course, for joining us as well. Remember, you can follow us on X, and be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel. I'm Andrea Sankey. We'll see you next time.